Let's just talk about the sentencing first of all, and life meaning life, ? Joseph Kotrie-Monson is a criminal defence solicitor from Mary Monson Solicitors on Fleet Street here in central London. So what does a life sentence mean, Joseph?
Well, good evening, Ian. I think, first of all, we have to acknowledge that this is a very difficult story. Disgraceful, calculated acid attack, essentially a hit organised by a jealous ex-boyfriend who was also convicted, and as you said, very, very long sentence there. 16 years set by the judge before being eligible for parole. This man, the attacker, Stefan Sylvester, carried out that attack, received that minimum of 6 years. Now, the law carries a maximum of life for Section 18 GBH, one of the only offences outside murder, which affords that possibility, although a life sentence for GBH is rare because it's not a murder, it's very serious harm. But judges, the reason that it carries that maximum of life is not for life to mean life. One can't get a whole life term like you can for murder for GBH. It is there, Ian, to give the judge a discretion, and a necessary discretion for the public protection, to set a minimum time before that person can be considered for parole, and put this in the hands of the parole board, who then go through a process which, in the case of Mr. Sylvester, he was unsuccessful at the first time in 2016, before deciding, erring on the side of caution, whether somebody should receive parole. And of course, absolutely necessary, wasn't it, that Daniel Lynch, the jealous ex-boyfriend, as if that makes any excuse of it, who was convicted, has had that minimum recommendation, albeit also for an offence of rape, of a minimum of 16 years.
How do you convince a parole board that you're no longer a threat to society, or indeed your original victim?
Well, there is a principle in our prison system, in our rehabilitative system. There are systems in place which, if inmates serving prisoners engage with, then they can demonstrate that they have gone through a process that means they're less likely to offend. Now, you've already identified the fact that this was a young man who was 19 years old, heavily involved in drugs. Vulnerable is the wrong word, but certainly the type of person that would be in a position where falling into a situation of crime, and I'm not making excuses, I know nothing of this man, might be more likely. And we are told by the parole board that during his time in prison, he has actively avoided antisocial behaviour within prison and has avoided violence, despite being under threat. And that's the key thing. He was clearly under threat because of the
what do you mean under threat? Someone was ready to sort of kick seven bells out of him.
If you have a client, as I sometimes do, who has a case in the absolutely in the public eye, and something as absolutely unconscionable as this case, an attack on a woman, attempting to deprive.
Oh, we've lost. We'll try and get Joseph back. So essentially, I want to ask him why the guy that planned it, the ex-boyfriend, gets twice the sentence and more than the guy who actually carried it out. So the people I want to hear from, as I say, there will be people out there listening to you, and I would really urge you to come on and share your story, because the best way of having a conversation about something like this is to hear from people who've got direct personal experience of what we're talking about here. And that is, so Katie Piper, we've got Joseph back. Hello, Joseph.
Hi there.
Sorry, you were saying, I was just going to ask you, so he was under threat, and he didn't succumb to anything to do with violence or drugs. Why would Lynch, the ex-boyfriend, get double, almost treble the sentence of Sylvester, who threw the acid?
Well, there's one very obvious reason, and that was that it was also attached to a rape offence. But let's break this down a little, Ian. Usually attacks with partners and ex-partners are crimes of passion in the heat of the moment. That doesn't excuse them, but it does mean...
So this is premeditated, you're saying?
Yeah, this is a combination, isn't it? A jealous ex-boyfriend of emotive and passionate, but at the same time calculated and planned to the extent that this person organised. Arguably, and it's not a popularity test, but arguably more more disgusting in terms of its planning and its seediness than the actual person who committed it, who was essentially a hitman who was on drugs.
Why? Sorry, just one point that comes to mind when you say that.
Yes.
Why do we call it a life sentence then? If it's only going to be 9 years or 6 years, as it could have been?
Because the discretion is that should that person not demonstrate that they are, and it's the burdens on them that they should be paroled, they won't be, and it means that if somebody is very, very dangerous but hasn't committed a murder, only a GBH, still very, very serious offence, and there is a likelihood that they'll do it again, well, they are not getting out of prison.
Right,
and
I
there
see.
are certain people for whom the state really must have that power to keep them out, because they're a danger and they will do it again.
And I'm speaking to Joseph Kotrie-Monson. He's a criminal defence solicitor. Has the law had to try and keep up with the introduction of acid as a far more common weapon?
Yeah, I think offences against women in general, and I think acid is a weapon. It's a particularly bad one for the reasons that I've mentioned. An attempt to deprive a woman of her face in a society in which women are judged by their looks. You know, it's something that we find disgraceful. There are guidelines in relation to acid attacks. There are also separate offences, administering noxious substances. I think probably from the 19th century these offences still exist. But I think the reality is that offences against women in general have been really ignored in the way in which the criminal law has evolved until recent years. And, you know, the Me Too movement, the sexual offences scandals we've had, these are a reaction and a swinging of the pendulum, you know, sometimes appropriate, in many occasions not appropriate, but, you know, and driven by the press rather than true justice. But what we're seeing now is a shift in the way in which offences against women are treated, and life sentences of these type absolutely are appropriate in these types of cases because of the public protection. But the parole board should also be allowed to do their job, and we don't have access to all of the factors, all of the information that led to their decision. But in a democratic society, governments that we have elected have brought about these systems so that the justice system A functions, but B functions to protect society, but B functions in such a way that if somebody is capable of being reformed, then that takes place.
Right. Okay, Joseph, thank you. Joseph Kotrie-Monson, who's a criminal defence